So, welcome to Chatham House and this lunchtime event. I'm Gordon Carrera, security correspondent at the BBC, here to introduce Jonathan Powell, who will be giving a short talk. Just the logistics first of all. This event is on the record, not under Chatham House rules, but on the record. It is also being live streamed, so people around the world might be watching us on the internet as we speak. If you want to tweet about it, the hashtag is hashtag #CHEvents. Please could you switch off your mobile phones to avoid any interruption. I'll introduce Jonathan. He's going to talk for about 20 minutes or so and then take questions, of which I'm sure there'll be many. Jonathan will be well known to many people here, so just a brief introduction. Began his career in the Foreign Office, in the diplomatic service, became Chief of Staff to Tony Blair, serving in Downing Street, and most relevantly in this context, of course, was Chief Negotiator on Northern Ireland. Now, after leaving government, works primarily for Intermediate, where he's taken some of that experience in Northern Ireland to broader issues of conflict resolution, and particularly this issue of talking to terrorists. And it's a fascinating book, provocative, and takes a very strong line, but is also backed up by a huge amount of very interesting research and stories about different experiences and different conflicts and situations. So, Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you all for coming. As Gordon described, I've ended up largely by accident dealing with terrorists for the last 17 years. It wasn't anything that I planned at all. Indeed, the first time that I met terrorists, I didn't feel at all warm and cuddly about them. I met Adams and McGuinness towards the end of '97. We did it in a room where there were no windows, so they couldn't be filmed meeting us through the windows. The IRA had injured my father in an ambush in 1940 in Northern Ireland. My brother, who worked for Mrs. Thatcher, was on their death list for 8 years, and I just spent a year trying to stop Adams getting a visa to go to Washington. So when I met them, I declined to shake hands with them. As did Alistair Campbell, actually, who was with me. Neither of us would shake their hands. We sheltered behind the table, and they proffered their hands to us. Tony Blair was more sensible and shook their hands warmly as he would have any other individual. It's interesting. It's a story that recurs again and again. When I started researching talks with terrorists around the world, it's an issue that always comes up, should you shake hands the first time round. About 3 days after that meeting, I got a call from Martin McGuinness, and he said, would I come and meet him in Derry and come incognito, not tell the Securocrats, the police or the army. So I asked Tony Blair, and he said, yes, go. And I got on a plane, flew to Belfast Airport, and took a taxi to Derry. I stood on a street corner feeling rather foolish, like some sort of sub-agent in some plot. Two guys with shaved heads turned up and pushed me into the back of a taxi and drove me around for an hour till I was completely lost. They then pushed me out of the door by a little modern house on the edge of an estate. I knocked on the door, and Martin McGuinness answered the door on crutches, making a not very funny joke about kneecapping, the IRA's favourite way of punishing people. We sat there for 3 hours. We didn't really make any breakthroughs of any sort. But then for the next 10 years, I spent my time once or even twice a week crossing the Irish Sea to go and meet them in safe houses in Derry, in Belfast, in Dublin, or elsewhere. And it came home to me that what was required if you were going to make peace is the ability to go onto the other side's turf, not to insist they came to Downing Street, not to insist that they came to Stormont Castle, but be prepared to take some shared risks and meet with them in those circumstances. It's about building trust. And of course, there are limits to how much trust you can build. I remember in 2004 when we were negotiating, we negotiated late, and we were in a monastery in West Belfast, and the monks very kindly gave us dinner in the refectory. And I was very worried I was going to miss my plane back to London. I kept looking at my watch, and the minute hand had become loose and was swinging around uselessly. And Martin McGuinness very kindly said he would take my watch and get it fixed. There was a very good watch mender at the end of his street in Derry. And I said, no, honestly, really, you don't need to bother. Please don't worry. But he insisted, and he took my watch away, and he gave it back to me 2 weeks later. And of course, I had to give it to the security authorities to have it checked for trackers. And they took it to pieces and broke the minute hand again, so I had to have it fixed at great expense. So I say there are limits to how much trust you can build in such circumstances. For me, Northern Ireland, at least in retrospect, was the most important and most satisfying thing I've done in my life, or I'm likely to do in my life. And I was very interested to try and find out how general the lessons I had learned from Northern Ireland were, whether they really applied elsewhere. Certainly there is no Northern Ireland model. You can't take what happened in Northern Ireland and put it down somewhere else. That would be ludicrous. The causes of conflict and the solutions are different in every conflict. But it's interesting for me, having looked back over the last 30 years and actually longer, at pretty much all of the terrorist conflicts around the world, particularly those since the end of the Cold War, that actually there are patterns. There are patterns to what works and patterns what doesn't work. When something fails in Sri Lanka, it may well be for the same reason it failed in Colombia. If it succeeds in El Salvador, it may have succeeded for the same reason in the Philippines. And therefore, I think it is worth trying to draw some lessons. The first lesson, for me at least, is that we always say that we are never going to talk to terrorists, and we always do in the end. Lloyd George in 1919 said, "We will never talk to this murder gang, the IRA." 2 years later, he was reaching out through an agent to try and get hold of the leadership of the IRA. He was trying to get them into negotiations. He used his young private secretary, also had a Welsh name, to try and engage Sinn Féin in negotiations, and he had a negotiation even in the same room that we negotiated with Adams and McGuinness in Downing Street. And we repeated that throughout our colonial history. If you think of Begin, we called him a terrorist, particularly after the King David Hotel. We hunted him down. We welcomed him later as a statesman. If you think about Kenya, Kenyatta, we locked up in the north of the country as a terrorist. We released him to come and negotiate with us. We signed a treaty with him and called him a statesman. We did the same with Archbishop Macarius, who we sentenced to exile in the Seychelles. We brought him back, negotiated peace with him, and had him elected as the first president of Cyprus. It's not just us who do it. If you look at the French too in Algeria, very much the same position. President Mitterrand, who at that time was the interior minister of France when the war with the FLN started, said we will never talk to the terrorists. By the end, de Gaulle was negotiating with them secretly in Switzerland, and that's what brought the conflict to an end. So it wasn't just us. But what we seem to suffer from is a sort of collective amnesia. We never remember what happened last time, and we never remember the lessons that we learned from the time before. And as a result, we nearly always start negotiating too late. And as General Petraeus put it in the case of Iraq, where he says the Americans left it too late to talk to people with American blood on their hands. You need to be prepared to do that. Hugh Gateskill, I think, captures it best when he says that all terrorists end up with tea at the Ritz as guests of Her Majesty's government. And that is largely the history of our decolonization. Now, the arguments against talking to terrorists are fairly obvious. Appeasement. George W. Bush made a speech to the Knesset in 2004, which he said talking to terrorists was tantamount to appeasement. It was similar to Munich. Now, it seems to me the point of Munich is that it was not necessarily a mistake trying to talk to the Germans to avoid another catastrophic world war. It was a mistake to think that you could buy Hitler off with a slice of Czechoslovakia. Talking to terrorists is not the same as agreeing with terrorists. The British government would never have negotiated a united Ireland at the end of a barrel of the gun against the wishes of the people of Northern Ireland. That was never going to be a subject we even discussed with Republicans, and nor should it be with any other of these groups. So talking is not agreeing. Agreeing is appeasement. Talking is not necessarily. The second argument is that you give legitimacy to an armed group by talking to it. That is undoubtedly true. Terrorist groups, in my experience, always crave legitimacy. They want to be talked to, they want to be seen to be talked to, and so you are rewarding them in doing so. I don't, however, think that is a conclusive argument against talking to them, as that legitimacy is largely temporary. In other words, to take, for example, the FARC. In 1999, President Pastrana started negotiations with the FARC at Caguan. They got legitimacy, they got time on TV, they were able to get their message across. However, when it became clear that they weren't at all serious about negotiations, when it became clear that they were simply fooling around, and when they went back to war, they lost legitimacy, and indeed they became even more delegitimized as a narco-terrorist gang. So it seems to me that you can at least argue that legitimization is a temporary price worth paying, because it will only be a temporary price. Lastly, people argue that you should not reward bad behavior. You should not encourage other people to take up weapons by talking to terrorists. But that, it seems to me, is to assume that talking to someone is a reward and not talking to them is a punishment. And at least for adults, that's not usually the approach we take in our normal life. If you talk to someone, you can discover more about what they think. You can find out where they're coming from. And so it seems to me thinking of it as a punishment is a very odd way to do it. The really conclusive argument, though, I think, is that if you look back over history, there doesn't seem to be a very obvious alternative to talking to terrorists if you want to end an armed conflict. Now, I am excluding from that minuscule groups that have no political support. So if you lump in a Baader Meinhof, a Symbionese Liberation Army, or even the Brigati Rossi into that category, they seem to me to be something completely different. They do not enjoy widespread political support. But if you're dealing with a group like the FLNN in El Salvador, like GAM in Indonesia, that has real political support, in the end, you need to find a political solution. Certainly, Hugh Ward, who was the Chief Constable in Northern Ireland when the Troubles ended, says he knows of no example anywhere in the world of terrorism being policed out. General Petraeus said of Iraq that we could not kill and capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. And I think that applies anywhere where you have this political element. Some academics have suggested that we can deal with terrorist groups by decapitation, by taking out the leadership. But the examples of that are not at all promising. If you look at Öcalan and the PKK, Öcalan was arrested, and for a short while PKK violence went down, but it went back up again and exceeded what it had been when Öcalan was free shortly afterwards. The same was true of Hamas after the killing of Sheikh Yazim. There are not many examples of where taking out the leadership really changes things. There's the Shining Path, which I deal with in the book, but even that, it seems to me, is not a proof of it. Now, the one example that's quoted as how you can end terrorism by violence or by security measures is Sri Lanka. And I think that does bear looking at. However, I don't think Sri Lanka really sets a model that any Western country could conceivably follow in dealing with terrorist organizations. If you talk to the Norwegian negotiators who worked on the Tamil Tigers, they will tell you that Prabakan, the leader of the Tigers, was considered to be a military genius. But in the end, he turned out to be a military fool. He decided to fight a conventional campaign against a conventional army. He suffered from hubris. Had he actually fought a guerrilla campaign, he would still be out in the bush fighting because it would have been impossible to defeat him. He made it possible to suffer a defeat. Secondly, the methods used by the Sri Lankan army to finish off the Tigers and a very large number of civilians at Nandikal Lagoon would simply not be available to a Western government or a democratic government in our sense. And lastly, the Rajapaksa has actually failed to deal with the political issue at the heart of the problem. Even after they had victory, they did not give the sort of representation, the sort of autonomy to the Tigers craved. And that, of course, is one reason why they lost the election recently and why now there is a government that is addressing the political problem. So it is true that in a dictatorship you can suppress terrorism simply by security means. Stalin had no difficulty whatsoever in dealing with terrorists. The problem even in dictatorships is that when you've dealt with them in that way, they tend to come back again. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we had Chechnya back again, we had the rest of the Caucasus back again. These conflicts are frozen, they're not dealt with. You haven't dealt with the political issue, and it will come back and get you. It is, of course, extremely difficult for democratic governments to be seen to be talking to terrorist groups. John Major stood up in the House of Commons and said it would turn his stomach to talk to Gerry Adams. He would never do it. At exactly that moment, he was corresponding with Martin McGuinness, the commander of the IRA, and thank goodness he was. If he had not been doing so, we would not have got to peace in Northern Ireland. That had to happen. Government leaders are often very keen to deny such contacts. In Spain, every Spanish prime minister up to now has denied they are talking to ETA, and up to now, every single Spanish prime minister has negotiated with ETA. Adolfo Suarez, the first prime minister after Franco, got up in the Cortes and said he would never speak to ETA. The leader of the opposition, Felipe González, got up and said, "But last night over dinner, Prime Minister, you told me you were talking to ETA." Suarez got up again and said, "I'm not talking to ETA and will never talk to ETA," while he was negotiating with them. So governments do deny that. I had a rather moving conversation the other day with Colin Parry, the father of Tim Parry, the 12-year-old child who was blown up by the IRA in Warrington. And Colin said if someone had told him that the British government was talking to the IRA when his son lay dying in his arms, he would have been horrified. If someone had told him that 6 months later, he would have been delighted, because then he knew that there was going to be a peaceful settlement to this conflict, that his son would not have died in vain. There would be something that his death signified. And I think that's something you actually find in quite a few places around the world. Because of this, it's often intelligence agencies that start these contacts. Nearly always it's an intelligence agency that opens the first channel. In the case of here, the British, we opened a channel in 1972 with the IRA through the SIS, and that channel was crucial at a number of points: the 1974 ceasefire, the 1980 hunger strike, and crucially between 91 and 93 in the correspondence between Major and the IRA. A similar thing happened in South Africa. It was the NIS who started the first conversations with Mandela, and they who opened the first channel of conversations with the ANC in exile in Switzerland. Making contact is not always that easy. Armed groups don't sit in nice offices you can pop in and call on them. They don't have addresses you can easily get to them. They are covert groups. Approaching them is quite hard. Sometimes the oddest ways, though, can work. One of my colleagues who was trying to negotiate with the Nepalese Maoists just couldn't find a way to get to them. Eventually, he fired off an email to their website, shiningpath.com, in honor of the Peruvian, rather horrible Maoists, and to his great surprise got a reply. And after several months, that turned into a meeting in an unfinished skyscraper in Delhi. Another had to contact the leadership of GAM in Stockholm, had no idea how to get hold of them, but knew the name of the leader and worked his way through the Stockholm telephone directory until he got the right person with that name, who interestingly wanted to see him and said no one had talked to him for 30 years of conflict, and finally someone had come to talk to him, and he was ready to negotiate. The one thing I'd say about these sorts of contacts is that they take a lot longer than people think. There is an educative function you have to go through, which really is time-consuming. Many terrorist groups live in ghettos, often literally as well as figuratively, and they only talk to people who share their views. To try and break them out of that, and indeed for the governments to understand better what they think, you need really quite a long period of conversation. People think that you can just suddenly go like this and you're going to have a negotiation. That is not the way that it works. I'm going to have to sort of miss out most of the things I wanted to say because I do want to get to the questions, which will be a lot more interesting than what I have to say. But let me just say 2 or 3 things. One is that I'm saying you should always talk to terrorists. I'm not saying it is always the right moment to negotiate with terrorists. Those are 2 different things. Looking back over history, the times when negotiations seem most likely to succeed are when there are 2 factors in play. The first is what the academics call a mutually hurting stalemate. You need to have in place not just a military stalemate, not just sort of neither side can win, but both sides hurting and realizing that they cannot win. In Northern Ireland, that happened, well, for the British Army, it happened towards the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. They realized they could contain the IRA forever, but they were not going to be able to annihilate it. Likewise, I think Adams and McGuinness realized in about the mid-1980s that they could go on fighting forever. They were never going to be wiped out by the British security authorities, but nor were they ever going to drive the Brits out. And they could see their sons, daughters, cousins getting killed, getting arrested. This could go on forever. And that's when they reached out to John Hume, to the Irish government, and eventually to the British government. And there is a generational aspect to this, interestingly. You know, they had joined the Republican movement very young. By the mid-80s, they were well past fighting age, and they could see the fruitlessness of it. You see the same thing with the FARC in Colombia at the moment. Most of the members of the 7-man secretariat are in their 60s, and it's a lot less fun running around in the jungle with gout or lumbago or the other things that we elderly people suffer from than it is when you're younger, and you therefore tend to sue for peace. The second factor that tends to have a big impact is having strong leaders. I think one of the reasons in the Middle East there isn't success at the moment is the lack of that sort of strong leadership in a negotiation. If you think of South Africa with Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, you needed to have both of them to succeed in a peace process. That seems to be generally true when processes succeed. In the case of Northern Ireland, we were very lucky to have someone like Adams and McGuinness who actually risked their lives to get to peace as well as their jobs, and David Trimble and Ian Paisley too, who also took very brave steps in order to bring about a peace settlement. And to have had Bertie Ahern in Ireland and Tony Blair in Britain in power for 10 years and willing to take risks for peace. In his autobiography, Tony Blair accused me of saying he had a messiah complex, and that's why he was able to solve Northern Ireland. It was actually Mo Mowlam, who some of you may remember of a rather colourful turn of phrase, who told me that Tony thought he was effing Jesus, which is not entirely the same thing as messiah complex, but it is sort of related. And it does seem to be that if you have strong leaders willing to take risks who believe that they can solve peace, then you are more likely to have a chance of getting to a settlement. There are all sorts of things I'd like to say to you, but I'm not going to dwell on it. But I would like to, in discussion, come to ISIL and whether we should talk to ISIL, which I was going to cover, but I'll cover that in question. So let me try and conclude. It seems to me that terrorism is not going to go away. Even if we were, by miracle, to overcome ISIL and overcome Al-Qaeda, there would still be new terrorist groups that would appear. Terrorism is not something you're going to cure. We've had it for several centuries, and it will continue to be there. There's no technological answer. No number of drones or jungle-penetrating radar will finish the problem for you. It makes it easier, but there's then an arms race with the terrorists who develop new ways of coping with with those weapons. The Americans, American military and Marines, have revised their counterinsurgency strategy twice in the last decade, once after Afghanistan and once after Iraq. The first time what they did was they added something we learned in the campaign in Malaya back in the 50s, which is the importance of hearts and minds. How do you actually win over communities who are supporting the terrorist group, what Mao Zedong called the water they swim in. So they added that, and the second time round they added what they called reconciliation. But what they meant by reconciliation in that context was simply buying off groups of the Taliban in that case, trying to persuade them to leave the insurgency. But that doesn't really solve the problem. My contention is you need both of those. You could not conceivably deal with terrorist groups without security measures and intelligence. You also need to address the grievances that they feed on. My contention is you need the third element, which is talking. If you think about it, if you put military pressure down on a terrorist group, they will resist to the last man. They will fight to the death. They will not surrender. If you offer them a political way out with no pressure, they won't take that political way out. You have to offer them the two together, the military pressure down and the political way out, fighting and talking at the same time. And if we look back at history, that is what seems to succeed. The other lesson is you don't necessarily succeed the first time you try and end a conflict. In Northern Ireland, we had Sunningdale in 1973, failed. Anglo-Irish Agreement in 85, failed. Downing Street Declaration in 93, failed. But the Good Friday Agreement didn't come from nowhere. It was built on those previous steps. And if you look at other conflicts around the world, you'll find that same progression, a series of false summits that lead eventually to a successful peace process. So I would argue that even the Middle East peace process, for example, frustrating as it seems, endless as it seems, the fact that it has failed every time before does not mean it necessarily would fail again if you had the components I was talking about. There's an interesting thing that happens when you come to an end of the peace process, and you move suddenly from the problem being insoluble to the solution being inevitable. You know, Northern Ireland, Churchill, Thatcher, everyone had thought Northern Ireland was insoluble. When we concluded the agreement, it was thought to be inevitable. It was about the economic circumstances. It was about 9/11. It was about the penetration of the IRA. It's very important that people understand both those things are wrong. There is no such thing as an insoluble conflict, and there is no such thing as inevitable conclusion of a conflict. Unless you have people who work at it, you will not get to a conclusion. So I think what I've concluded by looking back over these 30 years and longer, back to about 100 years or so, you can solve a conflict as long as you do have strong leadership, as long as you have the patience for the process, which will take a long time, much longer than you expect. And if you can at least try and remember what happened last time and make some new mistakes instead of repeating the mistakes of others again and again. Thank you very much.
Jonathan, thank you very much. I've already got quite a few hands up, so catch my eye. I've got one here at the front. Now, if you could wait for the microphone to arrive, and then if you could stand, introduce yourself briefly and keep your question relatively concise. And I have one here, and then one here, and then we'll work backwards and round. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Mike Harvey. What is likely to be, or what could cause this mutually hurting stalemate in Israel? And how long can it take to reach that?
Mm-hmm.
Let's go one at a time.
One time, sure. It seems to me the problem in Israel is that there isn't now a mutually hurting stalemate. Effectively, the wall has worked. It has stopped suicide bombs inside Israel proper. So one side is not hurting. If you look at Cyprus, for example, if you're a Greek Cypriot, why would you want to make peace? It's perfectly comfortable living as you are now. There's not a mutually hurting stalemate. It's a stalemate. It doesn't hurt. When I first went to Libya, I thought, about a year ago, I thought, oh, good, there's a mutually hurting stalemate here. There isn't. There's a stalemate, but it's not mutually hurting, and both sides can gain a little bit more on each side. So first thing to remember is that a stalemate is not the same as a mutually hurting stalemate. The second thing is they're not permanent phenomena. In Sri Lanka, there was briefly a mutually hurting stalemate. The Tigers couldn't win, the government couldn't win. At that stage, the Norwegian peace process succeeded. It got to a ceasefire, it started a political process. But Colonel Karuna in the east and his faction of the Tigers defected to the government, and the balance of power changed. So a mutually hurting stalemate is not a permanent situation. It can go away again as fast as it comes. It seems to me there clearly isn't a mutually hurting stalemate in the Middle East, nor is the strong leadership. I can't predict when that would come about again, nor do I particularly want to see people dying so that people have to talk. I'd like to think people would talk even when people aren't dying.
Okay. Okay, one next to you. And then
Thank you,
I'll go to-
Jonathan. Very interesting presentation. My name is Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. My question is about globalization, digitalization, and transnational terrorist organizations. So in ISIS, there are a lot of players, over 10 players in the regions, and also which government can talk, can negotiate with which terrorist organization. It is very difficult to figure out these days. And terrorist organization will be more transnational. And also it is very difficult to find out where the center is. And how do you evaluate such kind of a transformation?
Yeah, no, very good question. The first thing to say is that it's interesting that this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. If you look back at the time around the First World War, there was a similar period of very rapid globalization. Terrorists made use of that. They used the telegraph. The same slogans were shouted in Chicago by anarchist terrorists as were in Milan. They used the same sort of attacks. They communicated in the same sort of way. So we have seen this global phenomena in terrorism before. It's not necessarily new. Secondly, it seems to me you have to deal with terrorism at the root. In other words, if you were trying to solve the ISIS problem by talking to people in London who were or in Bradford or who were attacking people, then you wouldn't solve the problem. You need to go and address it at its root, which is in the Middle East in that case. The third point is about global organizations, as Al-Qaeda is, and ISIL appears to be becoming. Again, the point about a global group like that is it is both global and national at the same time. So if you look at Al-Shabaab or you look at Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, they all have very different wishes and demands. And you can actually sit with those groups and talk transactional business, whereas that may be more difficult with Al-Qaeda Central as far as it still has survived in the Badlands of Afghanistan. So my answer would be that globalization is not new, that you have to find your way to the root of the problem, and that if you were starting to talk to groups like this, you would start on a transactional basis in the individual countries where their franchises are.
Thank you. I have one question here at the back. And then...
David Blair, Daily Telegraph. Would you talk to ISIS? And if you would, could you explain how you would negotiate with a group which, unlike all the other examples you've cited today, has no rational or achievable objective?
Yes, I would. The thing we've done throughout history is said that every time we meet a new terrorist group that it is completely different from the last one we met. We so far had 4 waves of terrorism: the anarchists, the nationalists, the new left, and now the religious terrorists. And every time we say they're completely different. And of course they are completely different, but that doesn't necessarily mean the way that you deal with them is always different. You may find different ways of addressing them. And certainly up to now, we've always said every group we've met is irrational. You know, once we've talked to them, then we say they are rational, but before we talk to them, we say they are irrational. And actually, they all have a rationality. You just have to find a way of understanding it. When I left government in 2008, I said we should, on the basis of my experience in government, talking to the IRA, we should be talking to Hamas, to the Taliban, and to Al-Qaeda, 3 religious groups. Not surprisingly, my colleagues left in the government said this was ridiculous, and while it was fine to talk to good people like the PLO and the IRA, it was terrible to think about talking to these 3 groups. Since then, since 2008, the Israeli government has negotiated a ceasefire with Hamas. The American government has negotiated the release of Sergeant Barry Bergdahl with the Taliban. Eliza Manningham-Buller, the former head of MI5, has said we should be talking to Al-Qaeda. So attitudes change. These absolute views we take, these people are irrational, we will never deal with them, changes over time. In the case of ISIL, I do not for a moment suggest we should be negotiating with ISIL now. As I say, I distinguish between talking and negotiating. The circumstances for a negotiation require mutually hurting stalemate and some strong leadership. However, what's also true looking back over history is unless you open some of these channels early on, you can spend a very long time fighting and get to a conclusion much later with many more people dying entirely unnecessarily. So if I was in charge of policy, I would certainly use bombing, but I would not think that bombing was a strategy that was going to solve the problem of ISIL. It patently won't. Even if you have boots on the ground, it is not obvious how you would solve the problem of ISIL. And that is because ISIL appears to enjoy political support. It is not possible to take the city of Mosul with 1,000 fighters unless the population of Mosul thinks you're probably rather better than the Maliki Shiite sectarian government that they were suffering under before. And then people say to me, so what would you talk to ISIL about? Just as I wouldn't talk to the IRA about United Ireland, but I did talk to them about power sharing, about Irish language, about human rights. In the case of ISIL, when eventually we have a negotiation, the issue we'll have to address is going to be that role of the Sunnis. If the Sunnis are disenfranchised in Iraq, if they are suppressed, humiliated, and exploited, then we will have a very major problem. And the same is true in Syria. So there is a real political issue that needs to be addressed. In the end, the reason we were talking to Sinn Féin was not only because they had weapons, it was because they enjoyed a third of the Catholic support, even at the height of the Troubles in elections. So there's a political reason you have to talk as well as a military one.
Thank you. One here next. Okay. If you could wait for the microphone.
Sam Nassif, I'm a journalist from the Middle East. First of all, I would like to commend you for the book. The way you wrote it, you linked all the issues together rather than dividing it into chapters, Middle East, Asia, and so on. It's such an original approach. It makes us all understand that it's not just a particular phenomenon for a particular region. But when you come to negotiate with people who do not have a clear aim and who have other parties behind them who are very powerful and are funneling in money and arms and so on, are they actually the decision makers regarding what is going to happen? Or is there somebody higher than that? And wouldn't it be a better approach to try to not to get involved in military conflicts in these regions, as Tony Blair did, because the more military conflicts we are in, like Iraq, Libya, and places like this, the more terrorists we will have. And third, are you still an advisor to David Cameron? Because we heard at one time you were. Thank you.
Three questions. First question, it is very rare you find groups that have no clear aims. It's just that we don't understand their aims, and sometimes they don't understand their aims. So the point of sitting and talking to them, as I said earlier, it's very, very unusual to find a purely nihilistic group that has no aim. ISIL uses violence for a purpose. It wants to frighten people so they run away instead of defending themselves. They want to get attention in the West. And of course, we help it. We pay a huge amount more attention when they execute one Western journalist or aid worker than they execute 300 Syrian soldiers or 200 Kurds. I'm afraid we have a different attitude on. So I think talking is part of trying to establish what their aim is. In terms of influence from outside, it is often, or even regularly, a complicating factor. If you think about Ukraine and the separatists and the influence of the Russians, I would argue that even if the separatists are under the control of the Russians, it's still worth talking to the separatists because you need to try and understand how far they have any separate aims, how far they could be persuaded to different steps, despite their masters in Moscow wanting something one way or the other. So I think it is always worth talking to try and establish that. Certainly in a place like Colombia, where the FARC depended on the support of Venezuela, the switch by Chavez when he got sick, and this is again an interesting phenomenon that happens. When Chavez got cancer, he started going to church twice a day, and he started working to try and bring about peace in Colombia by pressuring the FARC to talk, having been their main beneficiary, person who benefited them and gave them housing. So outside influence can turn to a positive influence from a negative influence in the course of a negotiating process. Iraq, my next book is about liberal interventionism, so you have to wait a couple of years for the full answer to that question, and for the Iraq inquiry, of course. But I'm not sure that there's much evidence that starting wars necessarily makes the overall terrorist problem worse. It may attract terrorists to particular spots to fight, but it doesn't necessarily cause that. For example, and this is an answer to your next question, I am still the Prime Minister's Special Envoy in Libya. I'm luckily not paid on results because it's not going splendidly at the moment. But I don't think that you face terrorism there because we supported the rebels against Gaddafi. I think you face terrorism there because there's a vacuum with no government. And if you have a vacuum, that space, as in Somalia, will be filled by fighters who will be a threat not just to that country, but will be a threat to their neighbors, to Egypt and to Tunisia and to Mali, but also in due course a threat to Europe. And therefore, it's no good us staying at home and saying, let's leave that problem for someone else to sort out. In the end, that problem's coming to us, and we should try and sort it out where it is.
Thank you. I have one question here, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ewan Grant, former government intelligence analyst. Most of my work since I left has been in the ex-Soviet Union. In relation to your comment about the separatists, I do think there has perhaps been an opportunity missed by perhaps we need to engage more former military men here, now out of uniform, to speak to the Russians, because they will at least respect fellow military people. My question is about your earlier comment about loss of institutional memory, about how to talk and how to deal. Is that improving on a national or international basis, in that we're keeping some continuity?
Right. Well, your first comment, I totally agree about involving more military people in these sort of discussions. It's interesting, for example, in Colombia, where, a month ago now, the Colombian military sent 5 generals finally to meet with the FARC to talk about DDR. The sort of relationship was quite different than the political negotiations that have been preceded. And quite often it's the case that armed groups really long to sit with military men, and that we should use that. In terms of loss of institutional memory, I'm not sure I can honestly say it has got better. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to try and make sure that some of these things were written down in one place and people would try and keep them and remember them. It's quite interesting if you look back at British history, because having dealt with Ireland in 1921-22, the people who were administering the colonies in those days remembered the lessons. If you look at Palestine and the battle with the Mufti, the correspondents in the Colonial Office in 1926, I think it was, kept on saying, well, I was in Ireland and this is what we did with the IRA. And then other people would say, no, we definitely don't want to learn that lesson. We were intending to give Ireland to the Irish. We certainly don't intend to do that to Palestine. So, I mean, our ability to forget the lessons, or even when we remember them, not to profit from them, is extraordinary. And I wouldn't swear we've really changed. And that's why I think when we say every terrorist group is different, of course it's different. But is there anything we can learn with the way we dealt with the last one that can be profitable this time?
I've got one question here at the front.
Thank you very much. I am the press attaché at the Embassy of the Sudan in London. Your reference to what happened in our country, the negotiations in which Britain was involved and the US was involved to stop the civil war in 2005 was spot on, and thank you for it. It supports your pragmatic approach. And another detail in your book about the missile, the American missile, which hit Khartoum North, it did not hit an Al-Qaeda base, it hit a pharmaceutical factory, and the Americans later on recognized that they had wrong intelligence on that. My second point is that now we have a process of, we have some young people who are sympathetic to ISIS, who were caught training in a remote part of the country, but they were not faced with just military power. They were arrested and then taken to moderate clergymen who quoted the Quran and the Prophet's tradition and talked to them day in and day out, and 99% of them changed their mind about extremism and terrorism. So power alone, in the case of ISIS now, will not solve it. You have to also give the moderate Muslims a chance to engage and present a different point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I think you're quite right about de-radicalization, and Saudi Arabia is one case in point where they've adopted a very successful policy of de-radicalization, and of course in Britain that's been attempted too. And I think I haven't dealt with that in the book, but it is a major stream of how you deal with terrorism. I've just focused on one aspect, which is the political talks aspect, but you're quite right, there are a series of other steps that need to be taken.
Question here in the middle from the lady. Any on the sides? Got a few here.
Hello, Pig. I just want to come back to ISIS, but also to some extent, you've been talking about conflicts where you have two parties on the whole who are clearly identifiable. In the case of ISIS, who is supposed to be talking to whom to produce anything useful? And would you see this as a need also to expand it to the broader field of Sunnis talking with Shias?
As always, Heather, you're spot on. I'll just break it down into a series of different points. Firstly, actually, quite a lot of talks with terrorist groups are multilateral rather than bilateral. If you think even in Northern Ireland, we had, 7, 8 parties at the table when we were negotiating. So you very rarely have purely bilateral negotiations. If you think about Burma, for example, at the moment, there are 16 armed groups talking to the government, and that's now going to expand into talks including political parties. So it will be some 600 people at the table, which will get quite crowded. In terms of ISIL, I think really the people they want to speak to are the Americans. So in the end, it'll be the Americans that need to speak to them, as well as the governments of Iraq and Syria, if it had a government that they might be prepared to speak to. So I think if we look back at Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for example, and Petraeus is quite interesting about that, where he does say that they should have started talking to them earlier. If they were going to get the Anbar awakening, they should have actually made contact with people who they didn't like a lot earlier on. And we, quite early on, started meeting people in Jordan, where we were trying to get a conversation going with disenfranchised Sunnis. And I think part of the trouble is people will say it was to do with the invasion, but actually it's also to do with pulling out and leaving in place a sectarian government rather than establishing a real dialogue between that government and the Sunni minority. If that dialogue had been real, had been really happening, if their rights had been respected, we might not have faced the ISIL challenge in the same sort of way.
I had one question towards the back from the gentleman back.
Thank you. My name is William Crawley, a member of Chatham House. I'd just like to ask you about the vocabulary of terrorism. Mrs. Thatcher famously wanted the media and enforced the BBC to deny, as she thought, the terrorists the oxygen of publicity, as she called it. Yeah. And it led to the absurd situation of terrorists being interviewed and their voices being voiced over by actors. What sort of policy would you pursue in that? And can I ask about the word terrorist itself? In relation to domestic considerations, the BBC has always used the word terrorist in relation to the IRA. In the World Service, which I worked for 25 years, the newsroom was very emphatic that we did not use the word terrorist. We used the word insurgents or killers or acts of terrorism, but not terrorists, and for the reasons that you explained in relation to the IRA.
Yes. Well, you're quite right, and I dwell on this in the book a bit, which is that terrorism isn't a terribly helpful word in this context, because terror is a tactic. It's a tactic that can be used by a government, by a deranged individual, by a group to draw attention to itself. So by defining some people as terrorists, you're really using that as a disparaging term to try and put them beyond the pale. And for example, in Nepal, the Maoists were listed as a terrorist group by the US. That did not stop them winning the election, but it did stop the United States being able to talk to the group that won the election. So it's not a very helpful phrase. So you might ask, why did I call the book Talking to Terrorists? And the real title of the book is Talking to Non-State Armed Groups Who Use Terror in Pursuit of Political Aims and Enjoy Political Support. The publishers pointed out to me that wouldn't actually make it onto the front cover, so I couldn't use that. But so you're quite right about the use of the word terrorism.
One here and then.
Thank you. My name is Suhair Solomon. I just would like to raise 2 points with you. What's the way forward for Egypt to get rid of the terrorists in Sinai in particular? And do you think that the Arab coalition have to stop their war in Yemen?
Gosh, well, this is something that makes me glad I'm not in government anymore, having to answer difficult questions like that. I would be fairly hesitant about giving advice on how to deal with terrorism in Egypt. I would say that what I would worry about if I was in the Egyptian government is that if you use simply military tactics against terrorists, you may end up metasizing the problem rather than curing it. You may have that terrorist problem spread right down the Nile and not just stay in the Sinai. You may find it going right through the whole country. So I would think quite carefully about what other tools could be used in dealing with terrorists as well as the kinetic tools, because our experience through a long history, starting in 1919, is that if you simply go and engage in punishment attacks by destroying villages, killing people you think are guilty, you will end up with a much bigger terrorist problem than you started with. So I wouldn't advise, be arrogant enough to tell them what to do, but that is one thing that will be on my mind and I'd be thinking about if I was the Egyptian government. In terms of Yemen, I think the situation is just so complicated that I haven't got a clue what the answer is. But clearly it's going to involve talking, and what's quite interesting was the Saudi steps yesterday and the talk about talking, and usually if there's talk about talking, you end up with some talking happening.
I had a question here in the middle. Just in the middle. You keep your hand up.
Thank you. Stephen Griffith. I was Anglican chaplain in Damascus for 5 years, representing the Archbishop of Canterbury to the heads of the churches. Has the Syrian government, having said what a terrorist is, and not using, that we shouldn't use the phrase, but I'm going to,
yeah.
Has the Syrian government become a terrorist organization?
Well, I mean, that's the problem with the word terrorism, as you say, that they certainly use terror, clearly. So from that extent, they are a terrorist organization, and so have other governments in the past and even in the present. I guess your question is trying to reach maybe more at, should we talk to a government that is a terrorist government? In other words, if it's okay to talk to terrorists, should we be talking to Assad, despite what he's done to his people? My view would be that it is worth talking to Assad. I think, as with Hitler, you're unlikely to necessarily be able to negotiate a peace process with him, because one part of the successful peace process will be him going. And one of the interesting things, I couldn't cover my talk, so you've given me an excuse to cover now, is that, because it's a changed thing, is the balance between peace and justice in these circumstances, and that applies to Assad as well. Traditionally, what happened when you had talks with a terrorist group is you'd have an amnesty at the end, you let everyone go. You can't do that now because of the ICC. And we couldn't even probably do what we did in Northern Ireland in terms of letting prisoners out after only 2 years, even if they'd murdered someone. So in this new world, you're sitting with a terrorist group or with Assad, and you're asking them to sign an agreement that means them going to jail for 30 years. And that is a bit of a disincentive. You know, if you're sitting there with the leaders of the FARC and you say, sign there and straight off to jail, they tend to say no. So how do we balance this need for justice and peace? You don't want the justice to get in the way of the peace. You don't want to be so doctrinaire. On the other hand, those who argue for justice are quite right, that if you want a lasting peace, you have to find some way of addressing the rights of the victims who've been abused in the process, and you need to find some way of actually having that justice. And so far, the world has not yet found the right answer to that. It comes to a head in places like Colombia, where a peace process is making progress, and if it succeeds, it will be the first one that has succeeded since the establishment of the ICC, and we'll have to find an answer there.
Thank you. One here, and then...
Hi, I'm Zara from the BBC. I wanted to come back to Libya because it's a very pressing issue at this time. What if you have multiple actors or multiple terrorists that you need to negotiate with, such as is the case in Libya? And what is the solution if that's the case? And would that prevent people leaving the country and possibly dying at sea?
For what it's worth, I think that the only way to stop refugees fleeing from, they're not from Libya, people using Libya as a starting place, is to try and establish an effective government in Libya. I mean, the previous boat people used to flee from Egypt or from Tunisia until the government managed to establish an effective way of stopping people leaving their shores. In Libya, there is no government, and until you have a government, it's very hard to see who could stop people fleeing in that way. I don't think there's a military answer to that. I mean, the idea of bombing boats or bombing people traffickers strikes me as slightly bizarre. So how do you actually go about that? And there's a reason for hope and a worry. The reason for hope is that Libya is not Iraq or Syria. It does not have the sectarian or religious divisions that you have in Syria and Iraq. It is actually, everyone is a conservative Sunni Maliki, and they basically have the same faith. Frankly, there are very few religious divisions in the country, or even very few political divisions. So it is an easier problem to resolve than, in theory, than Iraq or Syria. On the other hand, Libya has never had any real institutions that we would recognize as institutions. It certainly didn't under Gaddafi. It didn't really under the king, and certainly not under Italian or Turkish colonialism. So you're dealing with, in a way, the last bit of white space on the world map that's never had the sense of a nation. And that makes it very difficult to get people to see a common cause for a nation and why they should make compromises for the good of the nation. They have their group, their clan, their city, their tribe, or whatever it might be. And persuading people to make concessions is extremely difficult in those circumstances, and that's why it's taken so long. But I do think the UN has done a very good job and a very activist job in getting people together. I do hope that it can succeed in getting to a national unity government, because it's only that national unity government that will, for a start, save lives inside Libya itself, will stop the spread of terrorism and weapons, and will also, hopefully, stop the spread of people drowning in the Mediterranean in this way.
Question here on the front row.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. My name is Leo Fallick, member of Chatham House. Just getting back to this concept of mutual hurt. And you spoke about the wall, how that has altered the balance. But is it possible that the balance may yet again be rectified or evened out by pressure from outside? And obviously the only country that could possibly exert that is America. But is that politically unrealistic?
Well, I mean, America... Actually, you raise an interesting issue, which is the different types of mediator you can have and different types of pressure. So the United States in the Middle East is a very strong mediator. They can change facts on the ground in security terms, economic terms. In Northern Ireland, we in the Irish government were a powerful mediator. Most mediators nowadays are very weak NGOs or individuals who have very little power. In the case of the Middle East, it's not, I think, so much that an outside power would create a mutually hurting stalemate, because no one wants more people to die or to suffer to bring about a negotiation. And I think that the Obama administration has tried extremely hard to bring about negotiations. John Kerry has been indefatigable in trying to use American power to bring about a negotiation, but so far unsuccessfully. And no doubt he'll try again before the end of this administration. But that influence, external influence, shouldn't be exaggerated. It can't force countries or groups to negotiate against their will. Interestingly, if you look back at the IRA in the 1919 to 21, the American government at the time was pressing the British government very hard to negotiate. And of course, the British government was very much at the mercy of the American government in terms of its debts, in terms of the Washington Naval Treaty and so on. So there was an attempt to use pressure to get the British to negotiate. But actually, in the end, the British did what they wanted to do in those circumstances rather than anything else. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying I wouldn't hold your breath and hoping that external influence will be used sufficiently to bring about a settlement, although I hope it might make some progress in it.
We are very nearly out of time. I'm not sure if there's anyone left with... Yes, one final question here.
My name is Ewan Duncan. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Northern Ireland, but my question is really about British foreign policy. And I wonder if you'd comment on our foreign policy in recent times, because everything that we've talked about today, the invasion of Iraq and what it provoked on the grounds that we invaded, maybe in 10 years' time, Choka will answer that question. In Afghanistan, there's a clear case for going in. Afterwards, debatable. And of course, what happened in Syria, in Libya, we had a fair old hand in provoking, I would contend. So I wonder if you'd comment on foreign policy of the UK and how successful it's been and where it should go in the future.
Easy one to finish with.
Yeah, well, as I said, my next book is about liberal interventionism, and it's going to deal with every single one of those issues, and I'll have a very considered view in 3 years' time. However, without a considered view, what I find quite interesting is that we veer from one extreme to another. In Rwanda, we don't do anything and we let a million more people die. In Bosnia, we do almost nothing and let hundreds of thousands of people die. Then in Kosovo, we intervened against the United Nations, without United Nations authorization, against the Russian will, and that was relatively successful relatively quickly. In Sierra Leone, a tiny country, we intervened very successfully and very quickly. Afghanistan, we went in, I guess the jury would be out on how much good we did rather than bad. Iraq, I mean, I think the balance is not looking terribly good just at the moment in Iraq. So we seemed, and then in Libya, we sort of intervene from the air but don't go in on the ground. And then what happens when I go to Libya is people complain to me. Why did you not, after you'd done the bombing, why didn't you come and help us build a state? Why did you go away? which is a bit unfair because at the time the people in government in Libya were asking us to go away. And people here were learning the lesson from Iraq, we shouldn't go in and be Bremer and try and tell them what to do. But now they're telling us they wish we had done that and not left them with anarchy. Then in Syria we don't intervene and we end up with a whole lot more suffering than there is in Iraq. I mean, really, one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. So it seems to me we need to try and draw some sort of general lessons. If we go from Rwanda to Iraq and back and forth again the whole time, driven by what happened last time we can remember, which is maybe 15 months ago, then we're not going to learn anything, and that's the point of trying to draw some more general conclusions. Unfortunately, I think it's the case that it's going to be quite hard for Britain to play a leading role in that. We've run our armed forces down to such an extent that it's going to be quite hard for us to intervene in Brighton, let alone in anywhere else.
While we wait for that next book, the current book is here on sale. I don't know if you're signing as well.
Sure.
And you can get yourself a signed copy. And so thank you all very much for coming and for your questions, and thank you to Jonathan.